But thanks for joining us for this discussion, Prison Without Walls. We talk about mass incarceration, we talk about mass criminalization. Today we're going to kind of talk about mass surveillance. And we've done these panels before at DPA, and usually we talk about, we focus on the technology, how it's big business regarding the technology of surveillance, how that business impacts our policies. But this time I think it'll be a little bit different. I think we'll discuss more of the human side of who is being surveilled, what their day-to-day looks like, sort of an ethnographic look at mass surveillance and how it's taken off. Discuss some things such as racial disparities that maybe are not talked about a lot when you talk about surveillance. And also kind of how the notion of who's doing the surveilling has kind of been, delegated to those in the community, and it's not simply a matter of technology. So I'm going to have our wonderful panelists introduce themselves. This is the first time I've been on a panel where I know one person. These three brothers here, I do not know at all. We just met. But we did talk on the phone, and we had a great conversation on the phone. I was like, wow, these are some experts right here. It's kind of rare where I get on the phone and I'm like, man, these people know with a lot that I don't know. So I'll kind of let them introduce themselves. But this young lady immediately to my right used to work at DPA, Margaret Dooley-Sammuli. Margaret?
Samuli.
Samuli. Margaret
Dooley-Sammuli
Samuli.
is more fun.
I knew I was going to mess that up. But even though I didn't know her name, I consider her a mentor.
It's the last day on.
I know.
1 o'clock in the morning.
I was trying to hang with the youngsters. But she was at DPA when I first got to DPA, and kind of, trailblazed the path that I'm walking in now. I definitely consider her a mentor. I'll let her introduce herself and who she's with and what she's been up to since then.
Thank you, Art. And really, Dooley-Sammuli, Dooley-Sammuli, it's fine either way. So when I left DPA, I joined the ACLU, and I've been in San Diego. So I'm in the San Diego affiliate, leading a statewide team working on criminal justice and drug policy issues. Our biggest campaign this year is bail reform. We're not done, we're right in the thick of it. And then I just sort of took on an additional piece to support for National ACLU's Campaign for Smart Justice, which is the multi-year effort to reduce incarceration across the country by 50%, 50, just to get things started, and while at the same time trying to do that in a way that's really combating racial disparities in the system. So that's the goal of the campaign. My role in that is to support other ACLU affiliates on their bail reform campaigns. So learning from, taking what we've learned in California and trying to see what lessons can be taken or what can be improved, localized in other states. There are over 30 ACLU affiliates either engaged in or looking at getting involved in bail reform around the country. And so while this is with a lot of other people, I'm just speaking as an ACLU rep, but of course all of these campaigns are much bigger than the ACLU. But while we have so much opportunity with bail reform, there's also a lot of risk in how this is done. And I think in particular, there is a risk of settling for mass surveillance in order to get people out of jail in the first place. So that's something that I'll be coming back to today. But just to kind of finish, I probably went on too long already, just to sort of define surveillance a little bit for me for this conversation. When I think of surveillance, I think of not just a GPS bracelet, but having to call in, someone being allowed to come to your work. Okay, I'm getting the hook. Okay, apparently I shouldn't define it right now. I'm going to pass this on.
Give Margaret a round of applause. We just wanted to quick introduction, and then we'll come back and have everybody kind of do their opening statement.
Okay, all right, sorry.
All right. So I'm going to scrap what I was going to do. So I'm the #1 guy that Art doesn't know. So this will be hitting 2 birds with 1 stone. My name is Steven Renderos. I'm the organizing director at the Center for Media Justice. We're a national hub for racial justice leadership around culture, media, and technology. We're based in Oakland, California, although I live in Los Angeles, California, and we have staff based all over the country. The kind of primary approach or our entry point into this work is we kind of came into this movement, emerged as a movement that was looking to transform our media system for people of color in fundamental ways. And in that history, we went from fighting on issues of ownership and representation, media representation, which for communities of color, we understood we were always on the losing end of those things, to moving on to different issues, primarily because the means of communication have changed in our society. With the advent of the internet, we're now utilizing tools that not only allow us the ability to have our voices heard, but also generate a ton of data about us that can be tracked and surveilled. So as the means of communications have changed, so have the issues that we've worked on. So really quickly, we fight on issues of surveillance as it relates to police, issues of surveillance as it relates to immigrant communities. We work on the kind of the incarceration side of the work, which is like seeing the introduction of technology as a response to addressing mass incarceration. So those are all issues that we've worked on, that we care about, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Steve. I will say this is Chris Scott. This is a brother from our George Soros, a brother from another George Soros Foundation. Chris really impressed me on the phone. And so Chris, just tell everybody real quick, your title and your job and what you do at OSF.
All right, so I'm Chris Scott, Senior Policy Advisor for Open Society Foundation and Open Society Policy Center. I am a Senior Policy Advisor for Education, Youth Justice, and Policing Reform, right? OSPC, which is Open Society Policy Center, is the C4 lobbying arm of the Open Society Foundation. So we deal a lot with federal legislation and addressing policy changes, but we also dabble in funding, right? And funding organizations to do C4 funding around particular areas that we find are priorities and of interest to us and that help vulnerable populations. So I come to this work through a number of different lenses, from a non-traditional perspective when it comes to surveillance, because most people don't think about surveillance within education, re-entry. We oftentimes think about it in policing and criminal justice reform, but on the education front, you have to realize that all of the data that's being tracked and used for students is really about behavioral and connections to policies in ways that harm students. It's not for interventions that help students, close the achievement gap or get better or progress in their educational attainment or, becoming better students. It's all about addressing the normative behavioral problems that they have and using that in ways that's really harmful for students. So,
Okay, before you get too far, let's get
I was
through
gonna
the
cut myself. And we'll dig a little bit deeper into that. And so, from the policing perspective, it's really about predictive policing, how we use surveillance to surveil Black and brown communities for the advent of creating more prisons, more jails, and using that money in a way that is not productive to Black and brown communities. And I'll stop there.
Give Chris a round of applause. And lastly, is this on?
Yeah, we hear you.
Lastly is our academic, but even though when I talked to him on the phone, I did not get that feel at all. I just learned my man is from the south side of Chicago, Professor Bill. Tell me about him.
No, I'm wildly ignorant. So my name is Ruben Miller. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Chicago in the School of Social Service Administration, which is effectively a school of social work. For the last 15 years, I've worked with formerly incarcerated people, their families, and their friends. And my research has been on the experience of reentry. And so what I've done since about 2003 is I've worked with people from their point of incarceration and followed them out into communities over a number of years in Chicago, most recently in Detroit, in New York City. I've done some international field work in Belgrade, Serbia, in Glasgow, Scotland, in Malmo, Sweden. And I'm launching a new project that examines the interconnections between slavery and punishment, different criminal legal systems, the ways in which they emerge, and what that can tell us about our systems of punishment here in the port cities that were most involved in the transatlantic slave trade. And so that's called On the Tracks of Empire. I'm happy to talk about that another time. But I started this work as a volunteer chaplain in Cook County Jail. I spent about 5 years counseling men, sitting with them, working with them. And I would later discover that I had family that had been incarcerated. 2 of my 6 brothers, my father, etc. And so anyway, that's me.
Round of applause, please. Professor Miller, I think we'll stay with you right now. You talked about the carceral and social devolution of surveillance. And, speak to what that means to the folks. And also, just tell us what you learned from your ethnographic studies on this issue in Chicago and in other places in the country and across the world.
Absolutely happy to. And so, it's no surprise that people in this room, many of you have been following organizations like the American Bar Association that curates the laws, policies, and administrative sanctions that limit the mobility of people with criminal records. And so we know that there are 48,000 across the country, laws, policies, and administrative sanctions that keep people with records out of the political economy and culture. By that I mean out of civic life, out of the world of labor, out of, and even filters into their families in really interesting ways. Okay, so what does that look like? So I've written about this as mass supervision. Not just mass incarceration, but mass supervision. It's the ways in which law and policy regulates the movement of people with criminal records. And so what this means is, if I'm locked out of the political economy and culture, if I can't find work or a job, if I can't join particular kinds of boards, if I can't adopt when I want to, then I'm put in a structurally vulnerable position that no other group is put in. And so every interaction that I have with someone else, every one of them, starts from a disadvantaged position. The power dynamic is shifted in such a way that I have to rely on the person that I'm interacting with to do me the favor of engaging in everyday forms of exchange with me. So the employer, the landlord, the licensing official, the education counselor, the professor has to do me the favor of allowing me into the school, hiring me when I'm qualified for the job, renting an apartment to me when I have the credit, or the labor power, the money to rent that apartment. And so this has fundamentally altered the nature of social life, not just for formerly incarcerated people, but for black and brown people in the United States generally, because so many black and brown people in the United States have an incarcerated loved one. Over half of black women have a currently incarcerated family member. Well, it's 44%, under half, just under. 1 in 8 white women though. So white folks aren't escaping. Yeah? So what's happened is
carceral and social devolution is that all of a sudden, even the landlord, even the person, the academic counselor, these people are surveilling.
The landlord, the employer, your mother, your girlfriend is now made responsible for your management, your rehabilitation. So what the state has done is it's offloaded its authority onto communities of color. It certainly doesn't do work release programs. Those have declined by 60% in some states. So who's responsible for getting you a job? Who's responsible for making sure that you reintegrate your community? The community itself is made responsible. And so I talk about this carceral devolution. I'm happy to share things that I've written.
Thank you. And I want to acknowledge Susan Burton and Dorsey Nunn When you talk about the reentry community and work being led by those most impacted, these two are at the forefront. So if you can, give them a quick round of applause. You know, Chris, I think people don't know how broad surveillance can be defined and how it intersects with security. And I know when we talk about risk assessments, I don't think people usually see that as a tool of surveillance. But in your work, especially within schools, explain to folks how risk assessments can be used to surveil kids who may have gotten into a little trouble.
Because if we don't hear what you're saying, we can't.
Happy to
They're really interested in hearing
No
what you
problem.
have to say.
Thank you.
All for interpretation.
Give our translator. She's not scared.
No. Okay, so, well, my
Slowly,
name what's up?
slowly.
I got you. So my name's Ruben Miller. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Chicago in the School of Social Service Administration, which is effectively a school of social work. For the last 15 years, I've worked with formerly incarcerated people, their families, and their friends. And my research has been on the experience of reentry. And so what I've done since about 2003 is I've worked with people from their point of incarceration and followed them out into communities over a number of years in Chicago, most recently in Detroit, in New York City. I've done some international field work in Belgrade, Serbia, in Glasgow, Scotland, in Malmö, Sweden. And I'm launching a new project that examines the interconnections between slavery and punishment, different criminal legal systems, the ways in which they emerge, and what that can tell us about our systems of punishment here in the port cities that were most involved in the transatlantic slave trade. And so that's called On the Tracks of Empire. I'm happy to talk about that another time. But I started this work as a volunteer chaplain in Cook County Jail. I spent about 5 years counseling men, sitting with them, working with them. And I would later discover that I had family that had been incarcerated, 2 of my 6 brothers, my father, etc. And so anyway, that's me.
Round of applause, please. Professor Miller, I think we'll stay with you right now. You talked about the carceral and social devolution of surveillance. And, speak to what that means to the folks. And also, just tell us what you learned from your ethnographic studies on this issue in Chicago and other places in the country and across the world.
Absolutely happy to. And so, it's no surprise that people in this room, many of you have been following organizations like the American Bar Association that curates the laws, policies, and administrative sanctions that limit the mobility of people with criminal records. And so we know that there are 48,000 across the country, laws, policies, and administrative sanctions that keep people with records out of the political economy and culture. By that I mean out of civic life, out of the world of labor, out of, and even filters into their families in really interesting ways. Okay, so what does that look like? So I've written about this as mass supervision. Not just mass incarceration, but mass supervision. It's the ways in which law and policy regulates the movement of people with criminal records. And so what this means is, if I'm locked out of the political economy and culture, if I can't find work or a job, if I can't join particular kinds of boards, if I can't adopt when I want to, then I'm put in a structurally vulnerable position that no other group is put in. And so every interaction that I have with someone else, every one of them, starts from a disadvantaged position. The power dynamic is shifted in such a way that I have to rely on the person that I'm interacting with to do me the favor of engaging in everyday forms of exchange with me. So the employer, the landlord, the licensing official, the education counselor, the professor, has to do me the favor of allowing me into the school,
Oh, hell no.
hiring me when I'm qualified for the job, renting an apartment to me when I have the credit, or the labor power, the money to rent that apartment. And so this has fundamentally altered the nature of social life, not just for formerly incarcerated people, but for black and brown people in the United States generally, because so many black and brown people in the United States have an incarcerated loved one. Over half of black women have a currently incarcerated family member. Well, it's 44%, under half, just under. 1 in 8 white women though. So white folks aren't escaping. Yeah?
So
what's happening is
carceral and social devolution is that all of a sudden, even the landlord, even the person, the academic counselor, these people are surveilling.
the landlord, the employer, your mother, your girlfriend is now made responsible for your management, your rehabilitation. So what the state has done is it's offloaded its authority onto communities of color. It no longer, it certainly doesn't do work release programs. Those have declined by 60% in some states. So who's responsible for getting you a job? Who's responsible for making sure that you reintegrate your community? The community itself is made responsible. And so I talk about this carceral devolution. I'm happy to share the things that I've written. Yeah.
Thank you. And I want to acknowledge Susan Burton and Dorsey Nunn when you talk about the reentry community and work being led by those most impacted. These two are at the forefront. So if you can, give them a quick round of applause. Chris, I think people don't know how broad surveillance can be defined and how it intersects with security. And I know when we talk about risk assessments, I don't think people usually see that as a tool of surveillance. But in your work, especially within schools, explain to folks how risk assessments can be used to surveil kids who may have gotten into a little trouble.
Right, so risk assessment is tricky and interesting because each state, each school district has their own policy with respect to risk assessment. So one risk assessment is whether or not a student, particularly most black and brown students, are identified as needing special education services or additional services. If that is the case, there's a risk assessment that is done by a counselor, a teacher, or whomever, and that student is placed on an IEP, right? An individual education plan. That IEP serves as sort of the Bible or doctrine for that student. It says what resources they can get, what supports and services they have, how do you handle a behavioral issue related to their disability, and how do you deal with their academic achievement, right? Said student gets that IEP and it's set in stone for life. There can be amendments made to it or changes made to it, but there's a process that has to be had. When that student gets in trouble, does something bad, misbehaves, is accused of insubordination, or is acting out as a result of their disability, they are punished the same way as a normal student is, but with enhanced penalties based on what's in that IEP. So that includes mechanical restraints and seclusions. That includes physical restraints and seclusions. That may include isolation in a closet. It may include being removed from school no more than 7 days, but without notifying the parent. Because these are all things that are set up in the IEP, and each IEP is different for a student. So that's just an example of what a risk assessment looks like at a school level. I'll take it even a step further. Risk assessments are also used for students that don't have disabilities. So students that may have been suspended once or gotten in trouble once for being insubordinate or deemed at risk are surveilled by principals, teachers, administrators, and other folks. And this is an internal risk assessment, oftentimes based on the color of your skin, how you look, how you dress, what neighborhood you come from, et cetera, et cetera. When that risk assessment is taken, you have a file that's created. You're assigned a number when you're suspended. In some places, once you are suspended, it triggers an assessment to be made, whether you're at risk of being suspended again, whether you need intervention such as if you do the same thing again, you might get arrested. And if you get arrested, you're also referred to a juvenile court, which may cause you to end up in a juvenile detention facility. Beyond that, for students that are truant and you already have a risk assessment in place, they've assessed whether or not the student is going to be truant again. Oftentimes the response is to suspend you for 5 or 10 days, right? But let's say that's not working. That risk assessment done internally or either documented by the school, which most aren't documented because we tried the FOIA, which is the Freedom of Information Act of schools and districts with respect to how they're handling truancy or chronic absenteeism. And Texas is a huge bad apple in this respect. They go after the parents. So they ticket and fine the parents. If you're poor and low income and you can't pay that ticket, those parents are dragged into court. And if you still can't pay that fine, those parents can sometimes be locked up and found in contempt of court and held in contempt of court. So that's an example of how risk assessments play out within the educational space. One more thing.
Was this child criminally justice involved, or was he just have behavior issues?
Most times they stem from minor school-based behavior issues, right? The chronic truancy piece is if you miss school and you get suspended, you're not only suspended in Texas, but you also get fined. And they fine the parents. They ticket the parents for the student being truant or not attending school. And the last thing I'll say with respect to surveillance within schools, we've seen this play out in Long Island and also the interconnection with school discipline, immigration, and surveillance. In Long Island, there was a student who posted an El Salvadorian flag on his Facebook profile. He was picked up by the school SRO, local ICE enforcement officers, and was suspended by the school, all because he posted an El Salvadorian flag on his Facebook profile. They said that he was gang involved and involved with MS-13. This goddamn boy is El Salvadorian. So not only was he kicked out of school and suspended, he is now in a special detention facility for immigration enforcement, is likely going to be deported. And because he was suspended, the terms of his exemptions as a DACA student to be enrolled in school means that you have to be in school. They count a suspension as not being in school and a violation of those provisions. All based on him posting the El Salvadorian flag on his Facebook profile, which was being surveyed by the school resource officer and local administrators. So that just goes to show you how surveillance is playing a role within schools, but also it's not always through technology, cameras, metal detectors, fingerprinting, which, if you don't know, all happen within schools.
So Stephen, he mentioned what's going on in the world of social media, but I was somewhat surprised to hear that you all look to address racial disparities when it comes to surveillance. And so can you speak to how that plays out? I mean, we got some examples here. El Salvadorian cannot simply be prideful in his nation without being considered a member of MS-13. But can you explain to the folks how this kind of plays out more broadly when it comes to technology and mass surveillance?
Being Salvadorian, I mean, how many times have I posted a flag on my social media? I think one of the things that's helpful in this conversation as we're talking about contemporary examples of surveillance is that the surveillance that we're talking about is not something new. We often, in our organization, we have a national network called the Media Action Grassroots Network. It's about 100 social and racial justice organizations across the country. One of our members in Los Angeles, the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, sorry, I'm speaking slowly to support our translator. They often talk about that surveillance is nothing new, it's a continuation of history. And so there's a few, I think, historical examples that we can point to understand that surveillance, as we're talking about it, has always held a purpose within our society, and it's always been directed at specific pockets of people. We can go back to, freedom papers that freed slaves, freed blacks were required to carry to prove that they were no longer slaves. They would use that as proof and go register at a local county because they wanted to do that in order to prevent them from being picked up and kidnapped and sold back into slavery. So freedom papers is a form of surveillance in our history. We had lantern laws in places like New York that required freed blacks to carry lanterns in order to, at night, be able to see that here's a black person walking up towards you, and also to prevent large gatherings of black folks from getting together. The relocation of indigenous folks to reservations, you can consider that a human-based database. So we have all these historical examples. So I raise that as to contextualize that we're not talking about anything new. And also to understand that there's, as much as there's a history of surveillance, there's also a history of resistance that we can look towards. When it comes to addressing racial disparities in surveillance within the context of policing, that has always been directed towards communities of color. And there's a few, I think, interesting examples that we can point to now. And I'll highlight some of those technologies. So, there was a recent survey that was done in the top 50 police departments in the country. 20 of them are using predictive policing algorithms. My hometown, Los Angeles, is one of those cities. Chicago uses it, New York uses it. And the idea is that you can use mathematics to predict where crime is going to happen. Now, the data that they use for that algorithm is baked in with all sorts of racism. It's arrest data, it's zip codes, it's the age and race of people that are being used to make determinations on where to deploy police officers, where to arrest people, who to arrest. In the case of Chicago, they actually use a person-based predictive policing algorithm. So that's one thing. Over 50 police departments in the country have body-worn camera programs. These were very popular solutions in the aftermath of the murder of Mike Brown in Ferguson that was being touted to us as a tool of accountability. But it is a tool that actually faces the community, and when used in conjuncture, in partnership with face recognition technology, becomes a very powerful surveillance tool.
So hold on, face recognition technology, that's just not Hollywood, that's real?
That's real.
How is that being
That's
used?
real.
Tell us how that's being used a little bit.
Sure, for sure. So face recognition technology, the first thing folks here should know is that half of the country is in a face recognition database that is actively being searched on by the FBI. So how does this happen? Every time you're arrested, your face, a picture of your face is taken. Every time you go to apply for a driver's license, they take a picture of your face. All of those images, a municipal ID, all of that gets filtered into biometric databases is what they call it. So databases that track physical features, and your face being one of them. And you can use software to run searches to find matches on people. So the FBI, for example, uses it if they're searching for a person of interest. It doesn't even have to be someone who's suspected of committing a crime, just somebody that they're looking for. They can run a search through various different databases, and they have agreements with somewhere near like 16 or 17 states across the country. I'm not entirely sure where Georgia is in that. But they have agreements with states that allow them to access their EMV databases. So your faces are probably part of searches on a daily basis, and we have no idea that it's happening. On the other front, the way that these technologies function, this goes back to like racial disparities and embedding racism into them. When you create algorithms and you train them on specific data sets, they will be good at those data sets. So face recognition technology, the main ones that have been used have been trained on predominantly white male data sets. So it's really good at identifying a white male, but really bad at identifying black women in particular, and people of color broadly. So these are devices that are being depended on to track and find people, and it's inherently baked in with, racism as part of the design. So those are some of the, I think, examples that I would highlight in terms of how this is being used in ways that exemplify some disparities.
Thank you. And Margaret, I'm sorry for cutting you off, but I can tell you were starting to talk about cash bail a little bit and how the pretrial system and cash bail has potentially increased surveillance. And I'm also curious about how, the bail reform movement, they may have another take on surveillance, and then the immigrant rights movement may have another take on surveillance, and how they may not mix and match.
So we have a money bail system in the United States. It varies state by state, but most states have for-profit bail agents and insurance companies. So that means the current system is you are accused of a crime, and in order to buy your freedom while you fight your case, you have to come up with money that you will never get back. That money stays with the bail agent and the insurance company. So right off the bat, it's legalized ransom to get out of jail based on an accusation alone. This can be a substantial amount of money. No matter who's arrested, it is typically a female family member or loved one that has to come up with that money or put their house on the line. And so I was just talking to Roseanne Scotti in New Jersey, who led the bail reform campaign there successfully, that the bail industry describes their circle of care. So once your grandmother, I think this was their actual example, once your grandmother puts her house on the line, then she's your supervisor, your surveillance, they call it circle of care, I think. So again, they are now extorting the family. The grandmother, of course, is not being empowered. She is terrified that she will lose her home. And that is, so again, back to the earlier statement about how the community or the family itself becomes placed in this position of being the surveillance mechanism. And so not only does money bail drain families and communities of resources, so it punishes poor people, it keeps people without a lot of money with even less money, and creates immense tensions within families and networks. So in and of itself, the existing system is a system of oppression and surveillance. Now, reform should be better. We have to be careful, as always, making political decisions about what the thing looks like. And my top priority is to make sure that when we collectively, all of us, when we move and win bail reform campaigns, that we're not actually making things worse. So what you do not want to do is end up with a system where more people are released pre-trial, but everybody is on an ankle bracelet, or everybody has some kind of onerous conditions. You also certainly do not want to set up a system where if you can't afford to pay for the benefit of your own surveillance, including a GPS bracelet, that you remain incarcerated because you can't afford it. So we certainly don't want to set up a scenario in which everybody is surveilled, or that you, again, end up incarcerated if you're unable to afford this, this system. So, you know, I think in the larger societal, you know, technological development, we will fight it, but we're moving, we have mass surveillance, we'll get more mass surveillance. So we also have to think within the world of criminal justice reform, we don't want to add on top of that, but we also need to acknowledge and figure out how to work within a general societal shift, or maybe it's not new, but there's just more of it, more tools, more opportunity, and to be particularly skeptical of, you know, quote unquote, scientific approaches. You can put, you know, crap in, crap out, right? So we need to be very skeptical, and we need to really question these tools. What's the data going in? What's the problems with the data coming out? And how can we make sure, how can we put protections and limits around how these tools are used or not used? Again, risk assessments being a big conversation within the pretrial context, the bail reform work as well. So one of the problems is how many different ways the term risk assessment is used, and that it means actually a million different things depending on what you're talking about. But again, I think the shared problem is, you know, what's the data that you're putting in? What's the algorithm weighting? What's it? Is it basically, you know, the same as saying black is dangerous? Because that's not a tool that's going to help reduce racial disparities. So it's something that I don't know that we have been struggling with this in the world of criminal justice. I think it just gets more and more the case that we're struggling with it. The attraction is, well, it's better than jail. Of course, the problem I think probably many of us have experience in now is, you don't, and if you allow surveillance in place of incarceration without, you know, immense controls on it, you end up with a situation where it isn't just the people that would have been incarcerated that are surveilled, it's everybody, even the folks that would not have been incarcerated before. So it's that net widening that becomes so much more affordable in the context of surveillance as opposed to incarceration. So that's a whole lot of problems. So I look to my fellow panelists for solutions.
Opportunities for the state to increase its power around surveillance and around military conflicts around the world. Some of the technologies that we're talking about have actually been innovated abroad. Predictive policing, for example, that algorithm, the first kind of versions of this algorithm was developed by a professor at UCLA, innovated in Afghanistan and Iraq, and then brought back home and sold to police departments, including Los Angeles Police Department. Devices like stingrays, which pretend to be a cell phone tower that intercepts your cell phone traffic, that was innovated abroad, now being used in places like Baltimore, where we did a case study and filed a complaint about the Baltimore Police Department, which found that since 2007, the police department there was using this very powerful device that can, like, if I turned one on right now, it would automatically start communicating with every single cell phone in this room, every single cell phone in the next room, everything within range. It could do very invasive things like intercept your emails, your text messages, your location data. And in Baltimore, they were using this once a day since 2007. So I think it was over 534 times or more than that in the short window that we were looking at. And they were predominantly using it in black neighborhoods. So those are a couple examples, I think, where we've seen the kind of external war on terror being brought home. The last one I'll raise up is a more recent example as we're looking at the FBI's tracking of what they call black identity extremists. You know, utilizing, a former CIA director said, if we want to expand the capabilities of our intelligence community, you know, just call whoever you're trying to track a terrorist, and that will justify all these other things. So the FBI is using a new designation, trying to track people who are engaged in political activism, particularly against police departments and police violence, and utilizing this moniker to track them. So we're actually about to file a FOIA with the National ACLU to try to dig up the data of who they're actually tracking, and what will, my guess is we'll likely find a lot of people involved in our movements are very much at the core of who the FBI is going after.
Yeah, I don't have much to add at all, but I'd like to just direct us to a resource. There's a brilliant Professor Bernard Harcourt of Columbia University Law School who just wrote a beautiful book on counterinsurgent strategies that have been going on in multiple wars over multiple generations across time, and the ways in which strategies of counterinsurgency filter their way into everyday policing practices, everyday practices of welfare monitoring and management. So I'd just like to direct you there. His name is Bernard Harcourt, and the book, I believe, is called like The Counterinsurgency or something like that. Counterinsurgent. It's either out or will be out. I heard him give a great talk.
Have we seen drones being used domestically, and somebody can maybe share what constitutional liberties or constitutional protections, privacy, of course, is there anything else we may not be aware of when it comes to what liberties we're using or losing with the use of drones domestically?
So, I'll let Margaret speak to maybe the constitutionality of it. But I know recently there was an example of drone being used to subdue and actually murder somebody on domestic soil, right? Where they went in and blew up the individual, and I believe it was Dallas, right? Who had shot at the 5 law enforcement. And I think that raised a lot of questions and issues around the constitutionality of using a robot to kill somebody on American soil and an American citizen, in spite of the crime that they had committed. And just, Steve mentioned something with respects to freedom papers that made me think of, the different ways in which we're surveilled, right? And I think they oftentimes come at the most chaotic, hectic, or tragic things that happen in our individual lives, right? So I would just consider it as the most opportunistic time for people to collect data on us. So the Equifax security breach. Most of you all have probably been contacted by mortgage companies, banks. I think there's some members of Congress who have, said that you all need to go out and check your credit histories, check your credit reports, and put a credit freeze on your credit, right? So that you have to get contacted by one of the credit bureaus or an institution if you're opening up a line of credit or pulling your credit. But most people don't know that the Fair Credit Act allows you to freeze your credit, but now when you go to freeze your credit, they're asking you all kinds of personal information. They're asking you about whether or not you've been convicted, whether or not you have ties with certain individuals. If you live in, if you've moved multiple times within the last year or so, they're also asking you in terms of known affiliates or associates, et cetera, which is to me both flagrant and a different way of them trying to collect information that can be used in a multitude of other ways, but also just ties back into the surveillance piece, right? And so I just caution people around that, and just to also think about, how this is connected to the broader context of surveillance, and what that means, and how that information then gets used for a credit reporting agency to be asking you those questions to freeze your credit report when that's your given right under, the Fair Credit Act.
So what? Oh, yeah. The one thing I'll note about how these technologies show up, or how drones end up getting used locally, is what the ACLU has seen across the country is that typically law enforcement agencies have been adopting new technologies where local governments don't even know that it's happened. So there is, not only is there no public discussion, your elected officials aren't even aware that stingrays, for example, this, what mimics a cell tower, that it is already in use in your city. So in California and nationally now, I would encourage you to look at the ACLU's website for model legislation that would require local law enforcement agencies to have a public process, and therefore give the local government an opportunity to set guidelines and protocols but certainly also have a robust public discussion to ensure that people are aware that this is coming, perhaps stop it from being adopted. But I would, you might start by going back to your city and finding out what's already being used. I think it's quite likely that stingrays are being used by law enforcement in your city. I know I'm in San Diego, the county sheriff got drones, and they love to talk about how they're so important for firefighting. It's a big deal for us, of course. Right, and so we get all of these happy news stories about how drones are so great. They're cheaper, they're safer, and they're flying over people's homes. So it's really important that we have a public debate, because the default is what we're seeing, which is this all moving quite quickly and secretively.
And ALPRs.
And license plate readers as well, absolutely.
So Margaret, if a police agency wants to use information, can you hear me?
We weren't using it.
It's not on. That was the lowest one.
Okay.
I can't tell if it's like on or
No,
not.
that's good.
If a police agency wants to use information gathered from body cameras, and if they wanted to share that with FBI, Stephen, this might be for you. There's nothing in place that prevents them from doing that, or even forces them to, make it a public record.
Oh, we have multiple microphones now. It depends on the jurisdiction. I mean, that's the thing that becomes really difficult when we're talking about the data that is being collected, is that it's, in many cases, it's up to the discretion of the local police department whether they want to share that data with federal agencies like the FBI. In the case of body-worn cameras, what's also true is the policies that govern the use of those devices vary so much from one city to a county to a state. You have states like North Carolina that last year passed a law that basically will make it so that police departments never have to be compelled to release footage from a body-worn camera to the public. I think there was another state that recently passed that law as well. So, we're seeing these trends where the policies that actually regulate the use of these devices entrench the power back to the police departments. So going back to what I was mentioning earlier, body-worn cameras specifically became really popular after the murder of Mike Brown. You had the Obama administration saying, we're going to make millions of dollars available for local police departments to adopt these tools, because it'll breed greater transparency, greater accountability, and in practice what it's done is it's only further entrenched the power of police departments to surveil our communities. So it really varies from one jurisdiction to another. On the drones piece, the thing I wanted to highlight, to give you a sense of the problem, there are over 300 police departments and fire departments across the country that own a drone. And it's very likely that in your community, your local police department has one. They're being introduced and told to us, we will only use this in the extreme of circumstances, only when there is some sort of a terroristic threat, where the public safety is involved, or some other extreme circumstance. And the history of surveillance has taught us that, you may start with one intention in mind, or we may be told that there's only one intention in mind, but eventually there will be mission creep. Eventually we'll expand and affect the whole. We had that with COINTELPRO, where the focus was, let's go after communists. And then it was, let's go after communist sympathizers. And then it's like, let's go after Martin Luther King. And let's go after other civil rights leaders. This is a history that we've seen of this expansion. So we cannot allow at the local level our communities, our police departments to adopt these tools, because they cannot help themselves. They will use them in a variety of ways. And the case law to define how these tools should be used is not catching up quickly enough.
Yeah, we'll open it up for questions in about 5 or 10 minutes.
I just wanted to add one. This has been powerful and important and incredible. There's an obvious question on the table that we haven't named, obviously, which is also questions of privacy. Privacy, that's access to privacy. Who has access to privacy? Whose information is kept private? And what does that mean? Do we have rights to privacy? And this is in line, Stephen, with your old new comment. And so if we think about older ways in which people's privacy rights have been violated, we could point just to poor black women on welfare, for example, who get asked in the spirit of when it's time to freeze one's credit, who are your associations? Poor black women on welfare are asked not only, are you involved, who are you involved with, what kinds of illicit or illicit activities are happening in the home.
Your baby daddy.
What did you say, Susan?
Who your baby daddy?
Who your baby daddy?
Yeah.
On and on.
Yeah.
These interesting invasions of privacy. Then, once I get arrested before I'm ever convicted, there are mugshot databases that we can all just Google. Not to mention, quote, deadbeat daddies staying in the domestic sphere. If you owe over $5,000 in child support, for example, whether or not it's proven that that's your kid, for example, you can be listed on your state's website as a deadbeat daddy. What does that do for a job application? What does that do? And so anyway, I think it might be interesting for us to think together about, if I may, just like this question, just throwing this question of privacy on the table, forcefully, like naming it as a thing, violations of one's privacy, just for us to sort of kick around, if I may, for the 4 minutes we have. Is that okay? Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, I can start. So privacy shouldn't be a privilege, but it is. I also wonder, certainly in all aspects of our lives, there are racial disparities and differences with white supremacy and suppression of the other. At the same time, I think we're all collectively losing privacy as well. I mean, I think I think the significance of that is that when we all get less privacy, then that's again disproportionately impacting people of color and people of low income. And so the technology, the expectations, all combine to make to nearly eliminate, not just eliminate our privacy, but then use that information to shape our lives. I mean, right, so we have not only the algorithms within the criminal justice system, but the algorithms on job search websites, on Google. So the kinds of what you're even presented when they know who exactly is searching and what information, how to let those pieces of information shape the world that you see, the world that is available to you. So it's the combination, I suppose, of the invasion of one's human dignity and privacy, coupled with all of the tools and then the opportunity that is used to use that against you. I think it's so, some things have not been done simply because they have not been possible. And what's so disheartening is what's becoming, anything is possible. You get enough computer power, you can come up with an algorithm for anything. And so somebody's doing it. And so, our courts aren't keeping up with algorithms. I think our movement struggles to keep up with algorithms. So it's something that I think we probably, I know there are a lot of people that pay a lot of attention to this, but more of us probably should be.
I was just going to say a couple things. I think that in the privacy realm, I think that this is where I do think that a constitutional approach to solutions is limited. Because in communities of color, the Fourth Amendment, the 14th Amendment, have been things that have consistently been denied our communities. The Fourth Amendment, the freedom from the unlawful search and seizure, the 14th Amendment, due process. These are all things that for communities of color resonate as something that haven't been afforded to us. So I do think that the legal fight around creating the legal precedents around some of these technologies is important, but it is not a silver bullet. And it's very necessary for us to be part of a conversation on what we can do to center harm reduction within our communities. Given that we're in a landscape in which information about us is consistently being tracked, so there's a role for us to play around harm reduction and digital security, and teaching each other how to engage in secure communications. And this again has its historical roots as well. And at the same time, I think fighting for where we can be pushing for civil rights to protect our privacy. We were involved in a fight last year to get the Federal Communications Commission to pass rules of broadband privacy. This is like to dictate to your internet service provider, whether it's Verizon, Comcast, Charter, whoever, the rules of the road for what information they could and could not collect. And for particularly sensitive information, financial, medical, they wouldn't be allowed to track some information. And then for other information, you'd have to actually opt in to let them do that. Those rules were overturned under this current Congress, under this current administration. And now states are introducing legislation to try to basically do the same thing at the state level. So I think there's solutions that we can be fighting for that go beyond just trying to center, constitutional protections and are more about extending civil rights to our communities.
Thank you. We'll let Chris touch on that, and then I'll open it up.
I mean, it's a tough question and a tough conversation, right? I just think we have to get honest and real with ourselves and reclaim our privacy, right? And really understand that privacy is disproportionate. As a black man, I ain't got no damn privacy. So let's just be real about that. And understanding that as a woman, you don't have any privacy, right? Even though you come from a place of privilege being white, that gender piece disaffords you the level of privacy that you need from reproductive rights to health, et cetera, et cetera. And so we really have to get real about what that looks like, because to be, and I just have to go here and I have to say this, to be white in America affords you a level of privacy that I know I don't have. And we have to figure out how we reclaim that and fight for that in a way where we understand that if we reclaim privacy and we don't have disproportionality within privacy, we can most likely get at some of these other pieces with respect to surveillance, because you're only looking talking about surveillance for black and brown communities, right? And I'll just stop there.
And we also need to stop posting pictures on Facebook of dirty money and guns and drugs. That might help, right? I know we don't have a criminal defense attorney now, but I'm curious, is that stuff like considered slam dunk evidence? Margaret, do you know? I mean...
Well, interesting. Is this the open one? Okay.
Yeah, that's correct. Anybody have questions? I'll start
let's
the
just
chief.
do I can speak to the Facebook thing, actually.
You can?
So, hi, I am a criminal defense attorney.
Woo!
And what's interesting is that Facebook is totally fine turning over your stuff that you, by the way, voluntarily put out there on the internet. But if you want to get your own Facebook records, it is incredibly difficult. There's a procedure that they tell you online, that's not it. You actually have to hire a process server in California to track down their agent, to serve them with process, and then you get a nice phone call from their attorney. And it took extensive negotiations and a lot of time and effort for me to get my own client's Facebook records and get the case dismissed because he was sitting on his computer on Facebook posting a status update about watching the cops chase somebody that was supposed to be him.
But when you voluntarily turn something over, that's just considered, that's prima facie evidence. I mean, can you fight that at all, other than claiming to be hacked? I mean, is that just considered direct evidence?
I mean, if the government can get your Facebook records and introduce them in a case, yeah, but it's actually surprisingly difficult for them to get those and validate them in a way that's going to be able to be introduced in court, so you can fight it that way. And there are some companies that are fighting back against some of these government subpoenas, which I think we saw with Apple with the phones. So there's also voluntary efforts by some of these companies, and you can certainly do things to protect yourself, like using services that do try to protect your privacy using secure messaging apps like Signal and things like that.
All right, thank you.
I'll just,
Let me see the hands again, people want to ask questions. Okay. Go ahead, Stephen, touch on that quickly so we can get into the question.
Yeah. So on the social media piece, I'll give you a very specific example of how this can be. It's not even about posting a picture of you saying, I committed this crime, but there was a guy out in Detroit who sent his telephone number, his cell phone number, to someone else. He messaged it to another friend. The Department of Homeland Security, ICE, asked for Facebook to turn over that data. They did. They utilized the number, hit up the local telephone company, or actually in this case it was T-Mobile, to find out if that was still an active cell phone in use. They found out it was. They used the stingray to locate the actual person, and then arrested him for unlawful re-entry to the country. This was an undocumented warning. So there are ways, I think, that social media data, not just the stuff that we post like in terms of pictures, but just data, messages, that can be turned over to police departments in ways that can be very harmful.
If you have a question, can you line up behind this lady, please? If you don't mind, but I'm going to allow Dorsey Pruitt to sit down. But you got a minute, Dorsey.
I just got a simple question, because I be thinking about what is the impetus to fight, right? And I don't necessarily think that just by saying that, you have the right to privacy or constitutional issues will actually motivate people to fight. So like, I want to know what is the, what happens when our ethics outpace, or our technology outpace our ethics? Because you can do something doesn't necessarily mean that you should do something. So I want to know if there's any streams where these questions are being raised in an ethical way that would actually call into question not the constitutional rights, but the right period. Because I think that in order to motivate people, they got to have a sense that they're actually being violated in a much deeper way.
Thank you.
So for the 45 people that read my papers, I've been writing about it. An idea that I talk about is carceral citizenship. And the reason why I talk about it as a form of, what I suggest is that people with records, for example, aren't second-class citizens. They occupy an alternate category of citizenship with alternate rights, restrictions, and responsibilities. And I raise it as an ethical question so that we are thinking about what it means to live in a so-called democracy where we have two actual forms of citizenship. The reason why I say it's not second-class citizenship is because people with records cannot sue. You can't, a second-class citizenship is a contradiction. It's to say there's something wrong with the picture here. No. What I'm suggesting is that we have created our own form of citizenship for people we've accused of crimes, not even prosecuted of a crime. And I raise that again directly for that reason, so that we can start to think about what it means to live in a society like this. Yeah.
Thank you.
A lot of people aren't going to like this. I'll probably get in trouble. Probably some civil rights groups in here that make me like crazy when I say this. But I mean, you won't really get people to fight until it impacts them, right? So think of the Anthony Wieners of the world, the offensive line coach from the Miami Dolphins that got the video turned over, him snorting coke off the desk. Some of the high-profile members of Congress that have been caught up, who actually are now talking out loud and thinking about how do we deal with privacy, right? How do we deal with our accounts being hacked, et cetera, et cetera. And so it may be as simple as you fight fire with fire. You know, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And they start shaming and publicly embarrassing people who are in positions of power and the status quo so that it's an equal-sum game, a zero-sum game. But I'll shut up.
And the only other thing I'll add is I think the solutions to these conversations have to come from our communities. Body-worn cameras didn't come from us. Predictive policing didn't come from us. Risk assessment algorithms didn't come from us. Those are not community-based solutions. There's some examples where communities have been very active in the process of creating laws. So Rhode Island, the technologies that we're seeing in our communities need to go. And they've been fighting there locally to prevent LAPD from using the drone. They've been successful for several years, but that drone issue is coming up again. We've got groups out like in Minneapolis. There's a group called MPD 150. It's the 150th year anniversary of the Minneapolis Police Department. And they're doing a community-based research project that's studying the 150th year of the institution of policing in Minnesota and charting out a vision that is 150 years into the future to do away with the institution of policing. And I think we have to start thinking, talking crazy as one of the organizers there says, Ricardo Levins Morales, because eventually crazy ideas somehow become normal. So we have to think about radical solutions that are actually coming from our communities.
Thank you, Stephen. We're going to take 3 questions in a row, and please try to shorten your answers to 30 seconds for each of these questions.
Damn.
Running out of time.
So there are so many things I want to ask and I want to think about, but this one tops them all. So I'm in California, and we provide services to women exiting prisons and jails. And I had the experience of contracting with our government through, I was contracting, and the things that they had me doing, I terminated the contract and told them, I don't want your money no more, I'm not doing this. It's unethical, it's oppressive, I'm not going to be an extension of this, and all this information that they had me collecting, and all of these ways that they had me monitoring people, So what about that piece of it? And where does that go? What about that piece of it? And then, communities are struggling to provide different types of services to get their communities seemingly back in shape. But it's counterproductive what's going down there.
Well, on behalf of everybody in your community, thanks for turning down that contract.
Hi, thank you all for your thoughts. I really appreciate it. I'm a caseworker in Chicago. I work with we have a permanent supportive housing program that houses folks experiencing chronic homelessness, and many of whom, unsurprisingly, have had extensive negative interactions with the cops, jails, and prisons. So I'm wondering if you could maybe offer some, and I think Stephen, maybe you were speaking to this, and I just need it repeated, but some resources to share with the participants in our program, because something I see, we have a number of folks who are on electronic monitoring who I feel are really scared of getting locked up for doing something wrong, or and we will try to get them requests for movement to something that I think should be everyone's right to go to the doctor, and it gets denied, or they just never respond. So if I think I don't have a legal background, so I don't ever I want to respect where they're at and follow their lead. So if they don't want us to push, I don't want to push, but I also want to be prepared with resources to make sure they have all the information to make an informed decision. And particularly also as it relates to registered sex offenders, I hadn't heard that come up, and we definitely work with folks who are in that population and experiencing that huge stigma and also huge barriers to
Everything.
Everything, yeah. Being a carceral citizen, I really appreciate that frame. So yeah, if you can maybe just resources for empowering folks and or just, I don't know, providing information so they can make an informed decision, I guess. Thanks.
So we'll take those two. We have more time than I actually thought. So. I know Susan mentioned, how somebody who's trying to do the work is being sort of pushed on by the state to engage in a form of surveillance, and then with the young lady.
Yeah, I have a million thoughts about this. I'll keep my response to 30 seconds. This is precisely what I've written about as what I call carceral devolution. But the idea is that the responsibility to manage people with criminal records gets pushed from the state onto community-based organizations and actors. And in this case, you're being required. First, everyone needs to see the YouTube of Susan kicking the police out of her neighborhood. It is the most beautiful thing. Anyway, everybody YouTube Susan Burton saying no to police officers. Yeah. But anyway, but when I talk about this carceral devolution, and that's precisely right. So the responsibility to do the monitoring, managing, surveilling, and punishing gets pushed onto local community-based organizations and actors. And so a good strategy is actually one of resistance and looking for other sources of funding. The thing that we don't talk enough about are the ways in which our funding streams are a part of the problem. Right. Foundations, listen, foundations in the room, I definitely need some research money, like help me out, right? Help me out, but we gotta speak truth to power here. Right. When you set a particular way to go about solving a problem and then expect a community-based organization to follow the ways in which you say it should happen, you eliminate all that mobility, all that flexibility that we pretend we allow through things like block granting, through things like the idea that foundations will take care of the responsibility to begin with, through the innovation that you're looking for and you're seeking. So anyway, as far as resources are concerned, so in Chicago, I'd like to point to what I think has been for many years a beautiful organization called St. Leonard's Ministries. I just love St. Leonard's Ministries. It's abstinence-based, it's not harm reduction. I mean, I've got my own politics around that, and it's all good. And everybody's got their own politics of how to best do substance abuse treatment. I totally understand that. But St. Leonard's Ministries does something that's really interesting that doesn't directly address the problem that you're raising, which are people on ankle bracelets not being able to move in ways that they need to. But does address the overall mobility of formerly incarcerated people. And what they do is they send folks in front of them. They use job developers and housing specialists to go before them and say, I've got guys that are good, hire my guys. I've got folks that you should employ, house, etc. And every impact evaluation that's been done, at least a recent one, a very rigorous one, has shown that it's been effective. Recidivism reduction by 62%, not that recidivism actually measures anything. Housing, more likely to have houses, longer term employment, etc., etc., etc. And the idea of job developers and housing specialists has been empirically validated across the country. So anyway, so just as a set of solutions.
I didn't know y'all had a 501c4. They told me I couldn't lobby OSF. I know that. That's a whole different conversation.
We can touch on that after.
We'll talk after. But I mean, that's correct. 501c3 grant making entity of the OSF, you cannot use their funds for lobbying. Okay. Point blank. That's a hard
C3s
say.
can lobby though.
Right. They can lobby, but for OSF, they have.
That's a whole nother workshop.
But what I was going to say was with respect to the funding piece, is making sure that you understand what the grant partners are of those individuals that are providing the funding. And it's also incumbent on communities to push back and understand what they're good in and get those requirements set within the funding so you can have flexibility and mobility and be able to provide the resources and supports for individuals that you are serving rather than placating to what the grantee, the grantors of the funds want you to do.
So
Okay,
let me just say, just let me say this, Art, but there was a clause about their ability to change the requirements within the grant, And that's what they begin to do over time. It didn't start out like that. I would have never agreed. I do read the grant.
Okay, we're gonna have a community session about this at the bar.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm from India. I was just wondering, you said that all of this makes the state powerful, but I'm wondering whether that is just, is there more to it than meets the eye? In India, we're currently fighting back this massive attempt to put everyone on a biometrics database, centralized, like over 1 billion people. And people behind this are huge corporations.
Yeah.
Because people, we've been told pretty much that we don't value you because you're people, but we value you because you're data. And data is precious, and we're going to market you and make tons of money. And a lot of that is also, behind the scenes is big American corporations, tech corporations, security, intelligence, etc. So I'm just wondering whether any of you could speak to that.
Yes.
Who's profiting from all this?
Let's take one more and then we can address that.
Yeah, Howard Woldridge from LEAP. I represent them in Congress. Wanted to address the concern of the gentleman in the jumpsuit. You're asking, how do you get this privacy back that you'd like to have? One of the goals of LEAP, and I've been doing this 19 years, is to reduce the amount of contact between the citizen and the police officer, get my profession back to protect and serve, and only come in contact with you when you need me. And what we have today is the police have various tools, mostly the war on drugs, drug prohibition, to come after you legally, go through your door, do all this stuff we're talking about with the Fourth Amendment problem. And the fastest road for your privacy to get back is going to be to legalize and regulate all drugs. And I would urge everybody, I urge you and everybody here, that should be your first priority. We're seeing that in Colorado, where the state police have been reduced their searches of vehicles due to traffic stops by over 50% for black people after legalization of marijuana. So it's step by step. It's going to take a long time, but the road to more privacy is through legalizing all drugs. Thank you.
Spoken like a true league member. That's not a jumpsuit, Howard.
Yeah.
You want to take that?
We get that last one in.
My question kind of jives with the young woman from India also. So you all had spoken a little bit about the role of private actors. So I was curious if you all could expand a little bit more on the role of private securities sort of apparatus and defense industries, all the way from private security guards up to defense contractors and the developers of everything.
I'll jump in quickly to say a couple of things. I think a common theme that has been brought up consistently throughout the entire time we've been talking is that surveillance as a function has been exported just beyond policing.
Yeah.
It's being exported to individuals. It's being exported to corporations. It's being exported all around. So the role of private contractors, thank you. And what we're seeing is they are oftentimes able to use more invasive technologies, deploy more invasive tactics than some local police departments are allowed to for various different reasons. We saw that emerge a lot, obviously in Standing Rock, where private contractors were hired by the corporation there to surveil the activists who were the water protectors. So that's one thing. I think that we're seeing this exportation because those private companies do not have to adhere to the same rules and laws that perhaps even police departments have to adhere to. In terms of the private side of things, there are big companies that are driving this. So I'll name a few. Axon is the largest manufacturer of body-worn cameras. Earlier this year, they made available or announced that they were going to give out a free body-worn camera to every single police officer in the United States. Now you have to ask yourself, why would they do that? Because their biggest business is not the device. Their biggest business is the storage. So that's what they're really doing is, getting it out into the hands of police officers, so that then local communities are on the hook to actually pay for the data storage. Geo Group does a lot of the electronic monitors. Securus is one of the other ones. Geo Group. Securus also is involved in the electronic monitoring space. They're also one of the largest prison telephone companies. You've got companies like Harris Corporation, which manufactures stingrays. And then you have the companies that do the back end of it, which is all these tools create data. So then you need someone to actually run through and process that data. So that's where big companies like Palantir, owned by Peter Thiel, who's a huge Trump supporter, also the founder of PayPal. Palantir, their main role is not to provide technology to people, it's just to process data, to help law enforcement agencies make sense of the data, to do the things that they want to do. So those are a few.
I just want to name one issue that that is actually, again, sort of coming up in the reform context of the public versus private. So in the let's say bail reform, right? So if we're trying to get private for-profit bail agents and insurance companies out of the mix, the question is, if there needs to be a pretrial services entity, is that something that we're comfortable with local governments contracting out? And the answer, I think, is there's no way to have those services provided by the private sector in a way that's safe. So even if we would love to see pretrial services offered by community-led nonprofits, the challenge is the sheriff or Aladdin bail bonds can also establish a nonprofit entity and run the so-called pretrial services. We can't sue them in the same way we can sue a government. We don't have access to records with those private entities the way we do with a government actor. So in the area of surveillance, where there will be some, we really do have to think about whether this is an area, something that we want the private sector involved in at all.
Okay, we're running out of time. I want to get in one more quick question, but Chris, I want to know if you wanted to respond to Howard's somewhat assertion that legalizing our drugs will cure all of your privacy concerns, and maybe in relation to security.
To the jump seat.
And the fact that we can be surveilled without even the crime being on the table.
No, so I think Howard's comments are important, and that's one way to look at it. And we've had several conversations with League 2 around the police reform piece and what the legalization could do and how that would open up a lot of doors with respect to both policing reform and within how we tackle the surveillance of youth within the youth justice space, right? And so, particularly, youth who are carrying minimal amounts of marijuana, who are having contact with the criminal justice system and having their whole lives turned upside down and the collateral consequences that come along with that. So there are some very promising components and pieces to that that goes beyond, that's broader and goes beyond the scope of just a surveillance piece. So, me and Howard will sit down and talk. I know he threw that little jumpsuit jab because I hate being dressed up, and Howard go way back. So.
Take us home.
Just a quick comment and question. In New Jersey, there's some digital security trainings going on right now because we recently found out around the immigration detention issues that social service organizations who are serving people and collect data on those people, that ICE or another agency like that can come in and claim that data if they are using a website that a company owns that server and information. And so they do not actually own the information. And so I was wondering if that's common knowledge of these days, and are there trainings like that going on around the country?
Yeah, we've been doing digital security trainings that if folks want to find out more information, just visit our website, mediajustice.org. The way in which we're doing it, we're primarily focusing on activists of color and primarily bringing trainers of color into those spaces. In the digital security space, it's oftentimes, white trainers who are great and skilled, but I think we operate from a place that we need to be, building knowledge within our own communities. So we do those. I think that what you're bringing up is a very interesting point, which is that the data that's being collected using tools from private companies is also data that those private companies then own and can utilize in other ways. And there's been ways, there's examples of how it's used, like Thomson Reuters is one of the largest like aggregators of data. They purchase data from various different places. And the Department of Homeland Security is working with them to develop an algorithm to help them track 500,000 undocumented immigrants that are on their list of people that they want to go after and deport. But they don't have a real reason to do it yet. So they're using criminal data, financial data that they get from like, you know, companies like Western Union and MoneyGram to identify potential violations that could give them the data they need to go after an individual. So yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. So check out our website if folks are interested. We're going to be doing trainings locally. We've got them coming up in Albuquerque next week. In a few weeks we'll be in Philadelphia. A few weeks we'll be in New York, DC. So yeah, definitely hit us up.
All right, stay diligent, people. Give our panelists a round of applause.